an event we have long been waiting for here at the store. It's just such a delight to host Susan Coll, who is a friend and a treasured colleague of all of ours at Politics and Prose. And of course, many of you know her as one of our area's finest novelists. I also want to thank Barbara Mead, who is one of P&P's founders and previous owners, for allowing me to do this introduction. Barbara has always introduced Susan for her past books, so you were very kind to make an exception in this case and allow me the honor. And I think if you pay any attention to the news in town, you may have realized, although the book has not been out for that long, with the publication of The Stager, Susan has now become something of a local celebrity. She was profiled in the Washington Post today. Some of you may have seen that. She was on the Kojo Namdi show. Cheryl Strayed, the best-selling author of Wild, tweeted about Susan this morning. So in the midst of all this attention, we're just very grateful to have the opportunity to shower Susan with attention of our own. And we thank you so much for being on your home turf tonight. And for, by the way, always making this store and all of us look very, very good. So thank you for that. Susan was, just so that you all know, in addition to being a novelist, Susan was the first person that Brad and I hired when we assumed ownership of the store a little more than 3 years ago. And we hired her in part because she's such an innovative and inventive thinker. She's willing to take chances on things. She has a great imagination, as you know from reading her books. And she had lots of ideas, and we brought her on board. And since she's come on board, we have greatly developed and expanded our store's trips and classes and events, and also the publication of 2 volumes of something called District Lines, which is P&P's anthology of original works by local writers and artists. And I mention this because this anthology was very important to Susan. It was one of her ideas way, way back when we first started talking to her. Not only because she's so passionate about the craft of writing and about books, but I just want to say this, and it's important. Richard Peabody's here. He would know this. She is the ultimate champion of her fellow writers, especially young and emerging writers from the Washington area especially. And District Lines is truly a testament to her belief that there is enormous unrecognized talent. There's much recognized talent, but there's enormous unrecognized talent in this area. And it simply deserves a platform, and it is that generosity of spirit that makes her such a wonderful and integral part of this bookstore and also of the Washington literary community. So please take a look at District Lines if you haven't yet. I just think there are some contributors to it in this audience, actually. So you have an idea now of how busy Susan is at Politics and Prose, but in her spare time, she somehow also writes novels. The Stager is her 5th book. I think many of us agree that it's her best yet. I remember Howard Norman getting an advance copy and wandering into the office after he read it and going, "This is just so good. This is Susan's best book yet." And I think those of us who've read it agree with that assessment. In the novel, Susan uses a simple real estate transaction, the sale of a large house in upscale suburbia, to explore the comedy and absurdity of modern life, the excesses, foibles, humiliations, and yearnings that lurk beneath a gloss of faux success, happiness, and perfection. That the story takes place in a zip code near here, one that some of you may actually live in, could make the tale uncomfortably familiar to Washington readers. But fear not, Susan swears that her characters are entirely fictional, including her most engaging and adorable character, a rabbit named Dominique, although I swear I have seen him, or hundreds of him, running through my own neighborhood. Whatever her assurances, I suspect none of us need to look far beyond our own block, let alone zip code, to find real-life imitators of the book's other main characters, Bella, Lars, Elsa, and Eve. And just so you know, Brad and I have long suspected that the real reason that Susan became employed by a bookstore was that she secretly has plans to turn her comedic writing talents to examining the absurdities of this very place. So anyway, she says she's not, but we don't really believe that. And speaking of bookstores, it's a very brave thing to write a book while you're working at a place like Politics and Prose. Knowing that these advance copies are eventually going to be circulating around amongst your colleagues, which is exactly what happened. But not surprisingly, the book quickly became a staff favorite. And if you think we're biased, you only need to look at a recent review in the Washington Post, which called The Stager an antic tale that shows us what happens to people when they don't feel heard or seen, when they wind up walking around as human versions of a house that's been carefully denuded of the things that made it warm and welcoming, that made it a home. And similar praises come already from the Washingtonian, which called the book not a plain parody, but the work of a very good comic novelist subverting conventional structure and narrative. We are quite sure there is more praise yet to come. We hope that all of you will read the book and enjoy it as much as we have. Please join me in welcoming Susan Coll.
Wow, thank you, Lissa. I'm not sure I really need to say anything more after that, but I'm so grateful to everybody at the store. And as Lissa said, it has been a very scary moment. I work very hard to bifurcate my two selves, and when I'm at work, I'm here as a bookseller, and when I'm writing, I think of that as something completely outside of this realm. So to have this converge has been really kind of scary, but my colleagues have just been amazing and gracious, and I'm so lucky to work here, and thank you all for coming. I usually ask Nick, who's doing our videos, to cut me out when I do the introductions, and sometimes he'll say, I'll make it as if you were never there, but I guess that's probably unrealistic tonight. So I'm going to tell you about the stager. I'm going to do some background, and then I'm going to read a couple of short sections, and then I hope you'll have a lot of questions, because that's usually the liveliest part in my experience. So yes, I did have my home professionally staged. That's what inspired this book. I hadn't thought much about it when the house went on the market. It was right around the time that the whole real estate market was starting to collapse. Every day the headlines were getting worse and worse, and the realtor said, let's bring a professional stager in. I didn't think too much about that until this woman arrived and looked at my house and just started deconstructing it, taking all of the pictures off the walls and moving the furniture around and sort of subtly passing judgment on everything from my tableware to my placement of my furniture. And that was fine, but what I really started to think about was what a rich metaphor this was. The stager was coming in to depersonalize the house, to completely strip it of personality so that some other family could imagine themselves living there. And in a way, this role was equivalent to a mortician. She's sort of like ushering you and your family out the door. And also the metaphor of a complete stranger coming into your very private space and starting to muck around with your personal things seemed very rich to me. I thought, what if this person has no boundaries? Or what if this person somehow knows you and you don't know this person is in your house? So because my mind skews toward dark comedy, I thought, well, this is a very rich setup. So I knew what I wanted to do. I had an idea of the story I wanted to tell, but I really struggled with this book more than usual. And at one point, I had just expanded the narrative so much, it was kind of sprawling all over the place. I had multiple people having their houses staged. I tried pulling it back. I tried from this point of view, from that point of view. And then I thought, I don't really think I'm a novelist. I think I'm a painter. So I signed up for painting lessons, even though I had already once taken painting lessons at Glen Echo, and I'd sat for months trying to paint a pear to no avail. You would never, ever know that this was a pear. But I thought, well, I'll just work a little harder at it this time. I found someone on my neighborhood listserv who was offering private painting lessons. I thought, oh, private painting lessons, that's what I need. So I invest a lot of money in nice looking supplies. And I went once a week to her lovely attic. And I brought in the Elements of Style, the illustrated edition, which is illustrated by Myra Kalman, who I didn't know who that was at the time, but I opened it up and said, I want to paint like this. And the woman her eyes widened, and she said, okay. This was kind of the equivalent of walking in and saying, I want to paint like Picasso, but I didn't realize that it looked really easy. So I sat there for weeks and weeks, and she finally said to me, I didn't tell her very much about myself, but over the course of the weeks, I let on that I was a writer. And she finally said to me, I've looked at your work, and your words are kind of like Myra Kalman on the page. And I sort of thought that was her way of telling me to just give up this painting thing. But it was strangely helpful, because when I went back to the book, what I did, I just came back to it with a much more visual sense. And I really scaled it down into, in my mind, each scene was a sort of miniature painting. And especially the first scene. When I went back to that, I could see everything in this scene very visually. The colors, it was kind of a still life of the daughter of the owners of the house standing in her kitchen when the stager first arrives. So I'm going to read that. It's very short. There is a skinny lady with bright red lipstick and purple nail polish standing in front of my refrigerator when I get home after field hockey practice. Dominique is cradled in her arms, and in her hand is a crooked, nubby carrot with a bushy leaf still attached. She is trying to get Dominique to eat the carrot, but he won't open his mouth. I don't know who this lady is or why she's standing in my kitchen holding my rabbit, but since the first for sale sign went up in front of our house 3 months ago, I've gotten used to finding strangers in random places doing random things. Once I found a lady sitting on my bed with her shirt unbuttoned, nursing her baby. Another time, I saw a man going through my mom's dresser drawers. One lady even went around the house flushing all the toilets, while her husband sat in my dad's favorite chair in the living room reading a book. But no one has ever tried to feed my rabbit before. Dominique doesn't even like carrots. Also, he looks kind of sick. I'm surprised to see him since he's been missing for a couple of days, so I reach for him. At the same time, Nabila walks into the kitchen, sees the lady, and screams. In the chaos, Dominique winds up getting dropped. He hits the ground head first, and for almost an entire minute, he doesn't move. I worry that he's dead. But then, just when I'm about to tell someone to call the police or the fire department or my mom, he lifts his head, pricks his ears straight up, looks around the room, and hops out the back door, which is propped wide open, I'm guessing because of the bad smell in our house. We spend an hour walking around the neighborhood, calling Dominique's name. We see about 10 different rabbits, and even though they all look sort of like Dominique, none of them is him. So the book is told from multiple points of view, including toward the end, Dominique the rabbit has a speaking role. But it's also told from the point of view of Lars, who is the owner, the husband of the house. And he's a former tennis pro. He's blown out both knees. He's become obese. He's not doing very well. He's kind of stuck in this house from which his own rabbit has even managed to escape. And another part of the book that felt like it worked very well in the end emerged again from the trouble I was having with it and from my sprawling multiple points of view, which is that I'd written a whole part of the book from Bella's point of view. She's the co-owner of the house. And then I decided I didn't want her point of view in there. I guess I needed to write it so that I understood who she was, but I didn't want her point of view, but I needed to tell her part of the story. And by this point, I had just exhausted myself, and I really didn't want to go back and reinvent this. But I had already set in place the fact that Lars is addicted to a cocktail of prescription drugs that's really messing with his brain. And a lot of them, just because it seems to be the case, have a lot of letters, X's and Y's and Z's in them. And I thought, what if you had so many medications with the combination of these letters that it produced a strange side effect, one of them being an omniscient point of view. So that's what is going on with Lars. So he kind of knows things. So I'm going to read, in this scene, the omniscient point of view has not become clear yet, but you can kind of see how I get there. Were Bella narrating this story, she'd lean in confidentially in a manner that would make you feel that you alone are privy to the secret of my unraveling. Lars has been sweating and tossing and pounding his pillows for 7 nights straight, she'd say, and the dreams he recounts, sometimes shaking me awake at 3 a.m., verge on harrowing noir. Bella actually speaks like this, tossing out phrases like harrowing noir with the casual ease of a crack dealer counting $100 bills. Her thoughts line up in smooth, neat sentences, replete with proper punctuation, with just enough emotion to be suggestive of fonts. Without your even noticing, a mini thesis takes shape, with topic sentences and closing arguments that loop back nicely to echo her chief points. No ums or likes spill from her lips. Her speech is the grammatical equivalent of a military cut. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting my wife is robotic. Even in her sleep-deprived fugue, she shows interest in my dreams. Asking questions that go right to the heart of complicated narratives that have mostly to do with animals. Beaches full of toxic fish, weaponized penguins, a plague of crustacean-like parasites that have invaded our house and cannot be eradicated. On the 4th day of our trip to London, I awake with a nightmare about a rabbit whose cigar ash has set our house on fire. Later that same afternoon, when we're doubled down, dealing long distance with the Dominique debacle, I am troubled by the coincidence, concerned there might be some weird rabbit mojo amok in the atmosphere. Bella explains patiently, as if I am a child, that rabbits are prevalent figures in popular culture, appearing in books and advertisements more frequently than most people realize, and that my dream was likely inspired by Dominique's destructive habits. He's been quietly ruining our house for years, she reminds me, and this coincidence is surely meaningless. It can be exhausting to live with someone who always has the answer. I shoot her a withering look, or at least I mean to. I am no longer sure if my facial expressions convey what I intend. Bella has her own theory about what's going on with me. Buried in the fine print of the 3 pages of disclaimers that accompany the latest addition to the cocktail of medication she insists I take is the possibility of disturbing thoughts, hallucinations, vivid and unusual dreams, and episodes of psychosis. I've always been plugged into the flotsam and jetsam of the universe, and spouse-like, Bella might say witch-like, into my wife's brain. Some of this manifests as normal deja vu-y stuff, like dreaming about rabbits just before our own disappears, but sometimes I simply know things. And lately I know even more because things are crystallizing. My eye has become such a finely tuned instrument that I can actually see a ray bounce off the surface material and calculate the degrees of the arc at which it is about to bend back to me. Light carries energy in discrete quantities, and now that I have learned to harness this, it gives me strength. We argue about this frequently. Bella is a pragmatist. She insists these nocturnal animal visitations, as well as my ability to see and channel the light, are merely chemically induced side effects. But she's wrong. I've never felt clearer, and I'm finally beginning to understand. I am not as articulate as my wife, and although I am completely fluent and from a highly literate family, my late father was a well-known Swedish mystery writer. You are probably familiar with the whitewashed landscapes and his rugged, brooding, chain-smoking detective, Jesper Johansson. English is not my first language, so when she asks me what it is exactly that I am beginning to understand, I cannot explain to her satisfaction. Only that it has to do with the light, seeing the light, grasping the importance of diffraction and absorption, embracing the beauty of transparency. This is something Bella ought to understand better than she does, transparency being the centerpiece of her new professional life. You might think I am just casually tossing about metaphors, but 4 months ago, she was actually named the Vice President for Transparency for Luxem International, the world's second largest investment bank. Their new television commercials run in a seemingly endless loop on the cable news networks. Luxem International equals transparency plus efficiency plus accountability. Bella had been Luxem's vice president for North American equity derivatives for the previous 5 years, commuting from our home outside Washington, D.C. to New York most weeks, until the company became the subject of a long cycle of unflattering headlines, touched off by losing a class action lawsuit for defrauding investors in risky mortgage loans. This they might have overcome. Everyone was defrauding investors, so that was no big deal. But then, that same week, a trader went public with the fact that his team had been siphoning funds to build an underground pleasure palace in Dubai, the sordid details of which were tabloid fodder for weeks and involved underage girls without visas and a room full of goats. Yes, it sounds over the top, but I'm telling you, I don't know what kind of mind could make this stuff up. Part of my recovery involves a massive rebranding effort, and Bella, my personal, articulate, beautiful, brilliant wife, my Bella, who inspires trust among her colleagues, is going to be Luxem's salvation. The job comes with a mid-six-figure salary, stock options, and the potential for, but not the promise of, astronomical bonuses. The only downside of being Luxem's VP for transparency is that we need to relocate to their London headquarters. Personally, I find this rebranding campaign a bit elliptical. If you aren't already doing business with Luxem International, you are likely to view these commercials with great puzzlement. You might guess that Luxem is in the business of tailoring the sharp Italian suits the actors wear in the commercials, or that they manufacture those slim computers illuminated with the Luxem logo that appear on the background desks. Whatever it is that actually occurs beneath the veneer of transparency plus efficiency plus accountability, and to be honest, I'm not entirely certain myself, they want Bella badly. They upped the initial offer after she said no on the grounds of not wanting to disrupt Elsa, although I suspect she's really more concerned with disrupting me. You are only as sick as your secrets. This phrase has lodged in my brain like a splinter, even though I can't remember where I picked it up. 12 years into our marriage, 4 days into our trip to London, to borrow from the lingo of my wife's former profession, we are so far removed from the lead that we are buried in the jump. We pretend the secret away. We placate it, medicate it, tiptoe around it, construct overpasses and backroad arteries. We are now in the part of the story that lands in newspapers beside advertisements for convertible sofas and wooden fences, and is used to line bird cages or start fires or wrap fish at the dock. I shake Bella awake and narrate the arc of another hideous dream. I'm trembling so badly I may be convulsing. My wife urges me to take another pill. The management of my symptoms further erodes the memory, which may in fact be the point. While the sumptuous blue molecules dissolve in my bloodstream, she calls my doctor back in Washington and leaves another voicemail. Thank you. Well, having sat in that chair and run a number of events, I feel some pressure to get the timing on this right. And I don't. I think rather than just read, I'd like to start questions. And I see Brad standing right there. You're not going to ask the first question, are you?
Hi, Susan.
Hi.
How did you come up with Dominique? And was Dominique an original character? And this is probably pretty obvious, but is Dominique meant to supply comic relief?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking about Dominique. Dominique was actually inspired. I just hear a little snippet of something, and I sometimes launches a novel. And a friend of mine had a rabbit in her basement, and it was just destroying her house. It was eating the carpet, and at one point it chewed through an electrical wire that led to the refrigerator, and that was all I needed to hear. That rabbit was going in this book as the home was being staged. And I didn't really have any larger role for Dominique in mind when I started writing this. He was just a rabbit that hopped out the door. But as I went to work just trying to really condense this story into this miniature painting in my head, I realized that I'd already planted the seed of the narrative device that would pull the whole story through, which is this rabbit is missing the entire book, and everybody is trying to deal with this in their own way. So that really just was the thread through the whole plot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey.
Hey, Susan.
Hey, John.
I remember this from when we first met a few years ago when you were working on the book, and you've brought it up tonight. I'm just curious about the playing that you did with point of view and what that was about, and also how that kind of fits with what you're presenting in the story, with the themes that you're exploring, and how does point of view play in that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, part of my own point of view problems just stem from the fact that I don't really know what I'm doing when I sit down to write. There are writers who sit down and know what point of view they're going to tell the story from. My process is always pretty messy, so I just knew. It also became messier because when I started telling people about this book, including people I work with in the publishing industry, they were excited about this idea because it sounds like a good idea, but everybody had their own way of writing this book. And I think I listened to too many different cooks. My editor started sending me staging articles from the Times, and I was just trying to put every piece of every person's advice into this book, and it became a complete mess. I'm not sure if I had a grand plan in getting to a certain point from the many points of view, but I did like, by the time I got halfway through and different points of view started coming back to the same moment. That scene in the very beginning where you wind up in the kitchen with the stager and Dominique, we come back to that scene again from the stager's point of view, and it just, when I got there writing it from that point of view, I felt like, aha, this is actually finally coming together in that way. And Dominique's point of view, I don't know, he just started talking. I've never really had that happen before. I hadn't finished the book. I, by that point, was under deadline pressure to turn it in. I did not know the end. I didn't sit down and think about the end. I didn't decide to dream about it or talk it through with anyone. I just sat down and said, right. And it really just wrote itself like that. And the rabbit, I won't give the end away, but the rabbit, it becomes a little surreal, magical realism in the suburbs or something.
Can I ask a question?
I will repeat it, sure.
Okay. What you said about the art classes and their effect on your writing in this novel is very interesting, I think. Do you think it's changed you as a writer, having that visual discipline, as it were?
Yeah, the question is whether taking these art classes changed my discipline. I think it did. Certainly in this book, as I said, each scene I was picturing in my mind, and it helped me try to just be a more visual writer. But the other thing that really changed my process was I had the good fortune of being contacted out of the blue about 4 years ago by someone who may be here tonight. I'm not sure if he is, John Becker, a playwright. I didn't know him, but this guy just wrote to me out of the blue and said, hey, I just read your book, karlmarx.com, which no one had read. I was surprised anyone remembered that it existed. And he said, could I write a play from this? And I said, you can do whatever you want. So he worked on adapting it for the stage, and then I worked with him on it. And learning to, again, that requires thinking of each scene very visually, and it also requires relying heavily on dialogue. So for me, that was the biggest change in this book. I have scenes, the first scene in which the stager is sitting in Elsa's room playing with her was at the outside pretty much all dialogue. And then I went in and realized, well, that is not a novel, that's a play. But that was probably one of the most useful things that has happened to me, and he also wrote an amazing play. So thank you.
All right, I will ask a question. When you mentioned that you try to keep your bookseller self separate from your novelist self, but I would imagine that there is some influence that one has on the other, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how now being on the inside of this business has affected your writing.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Because I think it's put it in perspective in a really healthy way. I was very worried about that at first. And I really do try to bifurcate myself here. I don't want to come in and think about the other books on the shelf and, pay too much attention to my own sales. I very rarely look at them. I don't want to know. And it would seem daunting to work in a bookstore, especially this bookstore, especially with, such esteemed booksellers, and everybody's reading at such an amazingly high level. To be working here and writing here was very intimidating. But what I also realized, in a way, there's no illusions that my book is going to sit on the shelf for the next 10 years, but so few do. You just sort of see the daily flow of books coming and going, and there's something healthy. I don't mean this in the wrong way, but for me, there's something healthy in viewing them as inventory, because your work is just not as important as you think it is. When you're a writer and you're sitting alone and you're laboring over every sentence and you're sending emails to your editor who's not answering them because she's busy, it just can seem like it's way more important than it really is. And when you work in a bookstore, you realize there's just so many other books out there and your own work is not that important. And yet, I never stopped wanting to write. I can't stop writing. And so I realized that I'm doing it for a different reason, and I'm doing it for a more pure reason at some level than worrying about book sales. So.
You mentioned that Dominique started talking. It was like you didn't have control. Did any of your other characters do things that you didn't want them to do? And then when the book was when the book was over, did you miss them? Were they like gone from your life? Or?
Yeah, I love that. They did in that last few scenes that wrote themselves. They just all Lars. Behaved in a way I wasn't really clear what he was going to do at the end. I do leave it a little, I won't say too much more about that, but yeah, it really did take on a life of its own in that sense. What was the other part of your question?
And do you miss them?
Do I miss them? I do, but I feel weirdly like they've become part of my life in a strange way. I think because of the cover, which is its own story. I was really, really delighted with this cover because a lot of my I write dark fiction. It is dark. All of what I've written is pretty dark, and yet they seem to always have very cheerful covers on them. And then I think, especially Beach Week had this like stripe, girl with her pedicured foot in the sand and a pail and in the ocean, and it looks like it's going to be a really cheerful summer beach read, and it's not. So I had fully anticipated that I would be sent a book jacket with a stager on a ladder with a Cosmopolitan in her hand and a dust mop in the other hand. And this cover came out of, it emerged from an original black and white Bauhaus photograph that's very similar. It's almost the same exact cover, but she's wearing much better shoes than the original. And, it's slightly more interesting and menacing looking. And some people I showed it to said, oh, that's kind of a disturbing cover. Are you sure you want that? And I said, yes, I actually do want to skew in that direction. Apparently, I've been told that the British publishers thought this cover was too S&M, which which is saying a lot from the Brits. No offense, but a friend saw this cover And whereas I was just looking at the mask and the woman, and the only thing I insisted on was that they put the rabbit on the cover. A friend looked at this, and the first thing he saw was this chair. And I never would have noticed this chair. To me, it was just a chair. But it's, if you know anything about modern furniture, this is a Wasili chair. It's a, iconic, famous chair from the Bauhaus era, which I'm probably already explaining that badly because I don't know that much about modern furniture. But my friends who had not yet read the book said, wow, I can't believe you've written a book that has a Wasili chair in it. And I said, well, it doesn't. And he said, well, that chair, the art director, whoever came up with this cover, put that chair on the cover of your book for a reason, so you need to put the chair in the book. So I did. It had already been edited. It had come back to me with the first round of copy edits. And I really pushed back. I'm like, I'm so done with this book. This is going to take me days. And he said, no, you only need 5 paragraphs with the chair. So I went back, and this chair now plays kind of a central role in the book. So somehow, because of all of the new things that have come into my life as a result of it, it feels like it's still alive.
So, do you think this is your best book? Which of the 5 is your favorite?
Do I think this is my best book? Well, it's hard for me, as any of my friends know, to talk about my own books in those terms. My usual posture in publishing a book has been, I'm going to publish a book and I hope nobody notices. So I've never been very good at this level of public speaking or talking this visibly about my work. But yes, I do feel like, because of the struggles I had in writing it and because I slowed down, I've also been writing very quickly, feeling some pressure of fearing that the whole publishing industry is going to collapse before I finish my book, or, I have this contract, I have an editor right now, I'd better turn the book in quickly. So I've been writing very quickly. I do write relatively quickly to begin with, but I don't think I've allowed myself to take the time I needed, and working full time helped me slow down because I didn't have much choice. It limited my writing time, and I think that was actually really a good thing. So I took longer, I slowed down, I really narrowed the plot down, and I also think I've just finally given into my inner comic voice. It's something I've resisted from the start. When I wrote my first novel, KarlMarx.com, I had originally thought I was writing historical fiction about this really tragic episode in Eleanor Marx's life, which is that she committed suicide. When I showed this book to people, they thought it was really funny, which seemed like that was not really what I was going for. So, and I've resisted that because, of course, anyone who sits down and thinks they want to be a writer thinks they want to write gorgeous literary fiction. And I can tell when I'm writing, that's just, I can't do that. Or I can put the words on the page, but it's not really working. And when I know things are working, it's when I feel the comedy, and I can usually feel when that's happening. And this book, it did feel like something happened at a slightly different level. Hi.
When you write a book, do you have a particular process that you go through in terms of 2 hours a day, and you sit there whether nothing is coming through or not, you sit and you wait, or does it just come through you and you rush and say, I've got to get this down on paper?
Yeah, the question is about the process and whether I set myself a certain writing schedule and stick to it. And I do, for the most part. I sometimes will tell myself I have to write 500 words, and I can't get up from the desk till I've done that. And sometimes that's just really a mess, but that's okay, because then the next day you come back and you at least have something to work with. But if I do it by the hours, I'm going to sit here from 9 to 1. That does often just turn into a waste. And in fact, I found the hardest period of my life to write in was when my kids had finally all left the house. And prior to that, I thought, well, I can't write enough because I have kids underfoot and I'm, have to get them to soccer practice and I have no time to myself. Well, as soon as that phase ended, I would just sit there and I had so much time I was not using it very well. I would sit there all day and I would write very little, but I wasn't doing anything else. So I think there's a lot to be said for just being too busy, and then you use your time wisely. Yes.
Once again, congratulations on the beautiful profile.
Thank you.
And all that. So, but you would have noticed that one of the themes that is highlighted in all these articles is that, once again, Susan Coll skewers suburban DC life. So what is it about suburban life? Is it drives you right?
Thank you. The question is, what is it that drives me to skewer the area? And I'm glad you used the word skewer because I want to talk about that. It always surprises me when people say that I'm skewering anything or that there's a viciousness to it, because I get that it's perceived that way. But I don't feel that. I feel like I'm writing about it in a loving way. And if I'm skewering anything, I'm skewering myself too. I certainly am not excusing myself from any of the behavior that I've documented in my earlier books to do with crazy parents. I'm part of that, or the woman driving up and down Rockville Pike. I know who that person is too. So I would say that I'm not skewering the DC area, but whatever everyone wants to say is fine. But I can't help but absorb my surroundings. The first novel that I wrote was set in India, where I was living at the time. It was a dark comedy set in India that it's probably a good thing it didn't get published. It was pretty unpolished. And the second novel, the first one that was published, was set in my North London neighborhood where I was living at the time. And then when I moved back here, the whole suburban scene was so new to me. I had grown up in different parts of the country in the suburbs, but as an adult, I hadn't really lived the life of owning a house. That was my first house. Buying a car, getting kids to school. I found myself, after having lived a pretty exotic life, suddenly standing on the corner waiting for the school bus with school lunches. And that was all great, but it was really new to me. So I felt like I was coming at this as an anthropologist. And that stayed with me through every phase of my kids going through Montgomery County Public Schools. And as Lissa said, I really am fighting very hard against writing a store set in an independent bookstore, writing a book set in an independent bookstore. So now I don't really know what I'm going to write next, but maybe it won't be DC for once. Yeah.
Hi. I don't know if this is working.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, have you heard lately, I think in the last couple of days, there was something on TV about the staging, a new aspect of staging houses where they move a model family into the house? I wondered if you came across that in your research. I think it was on the Today
Wow.
Show yesterday morning, and then this article appeared in today's paper, and I thought, boy, you're ahead of the curve.
Wow.
So that's one. And the other is I'm a fan. We've met at the Rockville Friends of the Library. We
Right.
hosted you once. And so I'm thinking of that book, and I'm thinking this isn't the first time that you've dealt with somebody who paints a different reality. Your protagonist in Rockville Pike had a way of prettying up family photo albums.
Yeah.
And your staging, I was wondering if you were thinking of that when you were writing about staging.
Yeah, wow. That's a really good connection. I should take that to a therapist or something. Thank you. It's true, in that book, her hobby was scrapbooking, which is sort of a, gussied up photo album. And it is true that she was kind of staging her family in that photo album. She was kind of photoshopping people out of photos and photoshopping people into photos. And so it's true. I guess I have long been fascinated, for reasons I can't fully articulate, with the way we live in affluent suburbia. I'm fascinated with urban planning. I have no academic knowledge of urban planning, but my one of the characters in Beach Week, he was an urban planner. His job, he was immersed in arguments about the Purple Line and owl preservation. And for a while, when I worked for Bethesda Magazine, I had a blog about parking, and that sort of became more to do with urban planning and transportation themes. So I am very interested in all of that. And in fact, one of the inspirations for this book, in a way that will never be evident because I have just turned it into comedy, but the chapter headings or the section headings are taken from a book called A Pattern Language, which is known as a Bible of architecture from the 70s. And it's a beautiful book. It's almost like poetry of architecture. And I spent a lot of time reading that book. I'm not sure I even fully understood it, but it filtered into my thinking about the way these people are living. And I'm just fascinated with strip malls and the Rockville Pike itself. So that has all filtered in ways that I obviously don't understand as well as you do. Thanks. Hello.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, you mentioned your time, and I think you said the north side of London.
Mm-hmm.
How could you briefly compare and contrast Bethesda to North London? As far as the sensibilities of the people that you met and so forth.
I'd say there's a lot of similarities, actually, because this neighborhood was kind of the Northwest DC / Bethesda of North London, and the parental concerns were very similar. The school issues were very similar. So I think, it was all with a very British twist, but I think there were more similarities than not. Hampstead and Swiss Cottage. Yeah. Well, I'd say that we're right on time here. Right, Lissa?